Stop me if you've heard this one. The player with the aggro deck just exploded out of the gate with a strong start. Land, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Mana Dork. They untap on turn 2, drop a land, and now they have 6 mana to use. They crack their knuckles, cast their commander, and eye the table like a hungry wolf. So many targets, so few blockers. You and your other 2 opponents look back and forth to one another. You start desperately flipping through the cards in your hand. You won't have an answer for this unless you hit both of your next 2 land drops. Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how people are brewing with the most powerful cards available. One of the things that sets cEDH games apart from more casual games of Commander is the way in which it emphasizes, and really requires, players carry a significant amount of interaction, answers which can stop opponents who are trying to win, with sometimes upwards of 20% of a cEDH deck being stuffed with cheap, efficient answers. This is a concept called defensive speed, and that is what we are going to talk about today. The first place I heard defensive speed described was while listening to an episode of Limited Resources during the Amonkhet block. LSV described the role of mid-range and controlling decks in this highly aggressive format as needing to establish good defensive speed. Even decks that are looking to take the long game, to ramp out to powerful and unbeatable late-game threats, need to have a way to stem that early aggression in order to be successful. They needed to have good blockers and answers for an opponent's early threats. Defensive speed takes on a few different forms in Magic the Gathering. Having access to early blockers in order to ward off aggression, having cheap interaction to disrupt a more focused game plan, and having that versatile interaction which can disrupt a large number of different, more focused game plans. In particular, if you find that you have decks in your metagame which hit their critical turn before you can, the best way to keep up is to try to increase your deck's defensive speed. One of the jokes we frequently make on this podcast is it blocks Tymna. So much so that we did an entire episode on it. Early blockers who can stymie those early attackers can be very useful in Commander. The very presence of Tymna in cEDH definitively warped the metagame, where creatures had seen a lot less play historically. After Tymna hit the scene as a partner, Chain Veil Teferi almost completely fell out of favor because it was so easy to take out an early Teferi Planeswalker with attackers when that mono-blue deck often ran very few, if any, creatures. Outside of cEDH, having a few early creatures able to act as a blocker is often enough to turn an opponent's early aggression elsewhere. Aggressive decks will often seek out targets with no blockers to attack into first, to deal the most damage with the lowest resource cost to them. Being able to play a 2-drop chump blocker, particularly if it can block evasive creatures, or can trade with an important creature on the opponent's side of the battlefield, that can be really valuable, especially if you can find one that can also block evasive threats. Baleful Strix and Icefang Coatl are great examples, able to block and trade for just about anything your opponents might attack with, while also giving you a card back when they enter the battlefield. A lesson from cEDH, which continues to permeate into the general casual Commander metagame, has been the benefit of running cheap interaction to deal with those early threats. Swords to Plowshares has become one of the measuring sticks that players at casual tables measure all other creature removal against. Josh and Jimmy at the Command Zone have been praising the power of Swansong for years now, as a cheap counterspell which can hit most of the things you'd want to be able to counter, whether it's an instant or sorcery that threatens to end the game, or a powerful enchantment like one of the Theros gods or Dovescape, which completely change the way the game is played. Cheap interaction is particularly useful when we consider it in light of the model I've been citing in a few episodes: ready, set, go. Very briefly, this model posits that there are 3 broad stages to a game of Commander. Getting ready, where you are developing the resources you'll use during the game. All set up, where you have an adequate resource base to both interact with your opponents while also furthering your own game plan. And going forward, where you are trying to warp the game irrevocably in your favor for your game plan to put your opponents on the clock. If you want to know more about Ready, Set, Go, We've done other episodes on it, which I will link to in the comments. The earlier the critical turn that opposing decks are presenting, the earlier your deck needs to be all set up. One of the criteria I set forth for describing when someone is all set up is when that player can easily multispell. Cheap interaction means it is much easier to develop your own game plan while still having an answer available to faster decks. You are all set up at this point because you can develop your own game plan and have the mana ready to interact with someone else. Having 1 mana open to cast Swan Song or Swords to Plowshares, that's really easy to do. On the other hand, trying to keep 4 mana open for an utter end, that's asking quite a bit. By playing cheaper, more efficient answers, we reach the all set up stage of the game faster and can be ready to use those answers against a more focused, faster deck. The thing we must balance this against is the concept of versatility of the answers. The versatility of an answer that you have access to is something that is important to consider, because the more potential targets you have for your answers, the more likely you are that a particular answer that you happen to have in hand will be the answer you need to the particular threat you're facing in this particular situation. The iconic answer in cEDH is Chain of Vapor, which lets you bounce a non-land permanent for a single blue mana at instant speed. Blue bounce spells get stronger the fewer turns the game will continue for after this bounce spell has resolved. So the shorter the clock and the earlier the critical term a particular metagame errs towards, the fewer chances someone will get to recast the permanent that you just bounced. The iconic Swiss Army knife versatile answers outside of cEDH include cards like Beast Within in green, Generous Gift in white, and Anguished Unmaking in Orzhov colors. The challenge that we face in deck building is balancing this defensive speed with this versatility. You only have 100 cards to put in your deck, and answers are often going to be included at the expense of cards which directly synergize with your core game plan. We just did an entire episode on greed and respect and how to strike a balance with that. In addition, more versatile answers tend to be relatively costly, often starting at a mana value of 3. So your choice of the more efficient answers often means you're selecting to try to have more specific answers to the threats you come across in your regular playgroup, as opposed to having catch-all answers to go into a blind metagame with. Start by really trying to get an understanding of your playgroup's most common critical turns. Keep track of the turns in your games using a spare spin-down die on your playmat. When one of your opponents plays their first game-changing threat, that's the critical turn. The turn the opponent untaps with Krenko, ready to start making tokens, or when Merrin comes down and starts controlling the board with Fleshbag Marauders, or going to town with Sakura Tribe Elder to get way ahead in terms of mana, that's the critical turn. A good defensive speed for your answers is going to need to include spells with a mana value less than that critical turn. Having a better defensive speed for your deck is a great way to punch up with your deck without necessarily needing to lower your own critical turn. You can interact with those more focused decks with a lower critical turn while still having the ability to go over them with value and more powerful, if more expensive, spells. As we saw earlier, being able to both develop your own game plan and shut down an opponent's game plan is critical. This then begs the question, of course, are sweepers dead? These are often fairly expensive spells. Do we still have room to run them in the current Commander metagame? The card advantage you get with a well-timed Wrath of God is still amazing. But sweepers are just that, answers that are a powerful source of card advantage, which are trading off by costing a large amount of mana. Just as not every deck wants to run multiple 5-mana draw spells, not every deck wants to run multiple 5-mana sweepers. More efficient sweepers may have you covered, depending on what sorts of threats you need to answer. Consider spells like Pyroclasm and Toxic Deluge to deal with the goblins or elves decks that you face on a routine basis. If you're on a creature-based strategy yourself, you may be looking for sweepers which can spare your own creatures. Pyroclasms, again, are great, particularly if you have bigger creatures and the focus decks are running low to the ground with tokens. On the other hand, white has a large number of sweepers which only hit targets like larger creatures and may be able to spare their smaller creatures, such as one of the modes on Austere Command. That about wraps it up for this particular lesson from cEDH, and I want to know what you think. What spells have you found yourself slotting in to handle the more efficient threats your opponents have been presenting? Are there still some less efficient answers that make the grade for you that you don't think see enough play? Let us know. Leave us a comment on YouTube, where we are Gemstone Mine Podcast. You can add us on Twitter, where we are Gemstone Mine MTG, or you can send us an email, where we are gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.